Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. She watched from behind the fog glass as laughter rippled across the street like a slap with no hand. Dean leaned back against his sleek new cafe's railing, flashing that familiar half-smile, the one that once undid her like yarn beneath a cat's paw. But beside him now was Zara, all glossy lips and cruel giggles, pointing straight at the emptiness inside Whist Corner. The tray Alyssa held trembled slightly in her grasp, the ceramic cups clinking together like frightened teeth. She hadn't served a customer in 4 hours, and the warm smell of butter and sugar hung heavy in the air like a memory that refused to leave. Still, she stood there, face unreadable, as her former lover and his arm candy mocked the ruins of what used to be her pride. The sign above her, chipped and sun-faded, swayed gently in the harmattan breeze, the W in whist missing a screw. There was no denying it any more. The cafe had become a ghost in a town that no longer believed in second chances. Yet she stayed standing, her silence not from weakness, but a quiet vow that no one heard but the 4 walls of her empty sanctuary. The clock ticked louder with every second that passed without a customer, like a heartbeat counting down to an unseen ending. Alyssa turned from the window and moved behind the counter, brushing flour from her apron, though no one was there to care if she looked presentable. Her hands found rhythm in the dough she was kneading, each press a plea to a future that hadn't yet responded. The radio, set permanently to low volume, crooned a forgotten jazz tune, filling the silence with notes as hollow as her smile. Across the room, the high chair, once reserved for Layla, her former regular's daughter, sat untouched, a thin layer of dust forming on its edges like time's fingerprint. Alyssa paused and stared at it for a moment too long, blinking away the stinging weight that gathered behind her eyes. It was then she heard the voice in her head again, her mother's voice, as warm as butter on toast and just as fleeting. Flour rises if you let it rest. So do women, darling. But the problem was, rest hadn't helped. Her business hadn't risen. Her heart hadn't healed. She was a batter that refused to rise no matter how patient she tried to be. It had been almost a year since Dean walked out. One minute he was her co-dreamer, mixing recipes at dawn. The next he was gone with the coffee supplier's daughter and half their joint savings. When he left, he didn't just take money or plans. He took the air from the room, the music from the mornings, the taste from the tarts. Alyssa had patched what she could, stitched holes into her financial plans with needle-thin hope, and told herself every day that resilience was just quiet pain dressed in nicer clothes. But it was getting harder to pretend. Suppliers called daily with reminders that weren't even curt anymore. They were weary. Even Naomi, her childhood friend and forever cheerleader, had stopped insisting that things would turn around. And as for the townfolk of Glimmer Row, they always picked a side that shone louder. Dean's Cafe had neon lights, free Wi-Fi, Zara's cleavage, and a jingle on local radio. Alyssa had memory-stained wallpaper, 2 working sockets, and a bread pudding that tasted like 1994. She told herself that was enough, but every time she caught Dean's shadow across the street, smirking like her downfall was a well-earned punchline, that lie turned more bitter on her tongue. That evening, she found herself staring at the chipped rim of her favorite mug, the last thing her mother had gifted her before cancer folded her into silence. She reached for it, tracing the faded inscription, "You rise by lifting dough and people." Her hands, still damp with remnants of raspberry glaze, trembled as she held the mug to the light. It slipped before she could steady it. In one unforgiving second, it shattered on the tiled floor, its sharp pieces scattering like broken promises. Alyssa dropped to her knees, reaching to gather the shards, her breath hitching with every prick of ceramic against her fingertips. She didn't cry out loud. She hadn't in months. But as she sat there on the floor, surrounded by crumbs, glaze, and pieces of something that once held warmth, the silence broke her. Not because the mug was gone, but because it felt like a mirror. That was her, once full, now fractured. And the worst part? No one even knew she was hurting. No one was coming through that door. No knight in polished loafers. No miracle investor. Just her, the silence, and a night that smelled of cinnamon and endings. Yet even as the clock struck 8 and the shutters creaked in surrender, she picked up the largest shard, wiped it gently with her sleeve, and tucked it into her apron pocket. Not for fixing, just for remembering. Morning came without apology, slipping through the blinds like a shy visitor overstaying its welcome. Alyssa stood barefoot in her kitchen, the hem of her nightshirt damp from the sponge she'd used to clean the spot where the mug had broken. Her knees still ached from kneeling too long on the tiled floor, but she moved with the stubbornness of someone who hadn't yet learned how to quit. Outside, the town of Glimmer Row stirred to life. Vendors arranging vegetables, schoolchildren dragging reluctant feet, and the groan of diesel engines filling the silence with the noise of survival. She tied her apron like armor, hands moving out of habit more than hope, and switched on the ovens with the same reverence one might show a chapel bell. The dough had risen slightly overnight, as if unwilling to betray her entirely. She shaped each roll carefully, her fingers kneading both bread and bitterness. The radio whispered a morning devotional, the preacher's voice tinny and distant, talking about valleys and victories. Alyssa turned it off mid-sentence. The truth was, some mornings didn't come to inspire. They came to test whether you'd stay standing even when there was no applause. The bell above the door jingled once around mid-morning, and for a heartbeat, her chest tightened with unfamiliar anticipation. But it was just the mailman, a young boy with sleepy eyes and mismatched socks. He handed her 3 envelopes, none of them containing good news. One was a final reminder from the electric company, another a bank notice, and the last a glossy flyer from Dean and Zara's Cafe, offering buy 2 get 1 free lattes, and showcasing a picture of Zara posing beside a cheesecake like it was a beauty queen on talent night. Alyssa placed the envelopes on the counter without flinching, but her breath hitched slightly at the edges. She leaned on the back wall for a moment, her eyes scanning the space that once pulsed with energy, wooden stools now vacant, framed photos of past birthdays and anniversaries leaning at sad angles, the old jukebox in the corner frozen in eternal silence. She dusted off a seat, not because anyone would use it today, but because dignity sometimes lives in the smallest acts. The kind that don't make noise, the kind that matter only to the person doing them. It was in that silence that a small handprint appeared on the bottom corner of her window, delicate, smudged, and no taller than a counter. Alyssa stepped out from behind the display and approached it cautiously, half believing it was a figment of her tired eyes. But there, just outside the bakery, stood a little girl in a yellow coat with pink rain boots, her forehead pressed against the glass as if trying to understand the magic that once lived inside. Alyssa pushed open the door slowly, and the girl turned with wide eyes. "Hi," she said in a voice like wind chimes. "My name is Layla. You smell like Grandma's kitchen." Behind her stood a woman, plainly dressed in a brown shawl and dark skirt, her features calm and unreadable. "I told her we'd just look," the woman said, apologetic but firm. Layla frowned. "But I want the pink one with the berries." Alyssa crouched slowly, heart racing for reasons she couldn't explain. She offered a soft smile and said, "That one's called Raspberry Daydream." "Want to try it?" The woman hesitated. Alyssa added gently, "On the house." The woman's eyes lingered a moment too long before she nodded once. Alyssa didn't know it yet, but the world had tilted slightly in her favor, like the first leaf that falls before autumn properly begins. Later that evening, after closing time, Alyssa sat in the corner booth by the window, a habit she hadn't revisited in months. She traced circles on the table with the tip of a spoon, still tasting the residue of hope that the little girl's visit had left behind. The raspberry tart had been sliced and boxed with extra care, and when the woman handed her a crisp note with a tip far too generous for the simplicity of the purchase, Alyssa had protested. But the woman only smiled faintly and said, "You don't know who's hungry for comfort." Then she left, her heels tapping softly on the pavement like a rhythm only she understood. Alyssa had watched them until they disappeared around the curve of the street, then stood there like someone who just missed a train, but felt strangely lighter for it. Something about Layla's wide-eyed wonder, the woman's mysterious quietness, and the way her bakery had briefly felt alive again, it filled her with an uneasiness that didn't hurt. Maybe it was the kind of ache that meant healing had started. Just maybe. She turned off the lights, leaving the display window glowing faintly behind her, and whispered to the room, "Let's see what tomorrow smells like." The next morning began without announcement, only a quiet blush on the horizon and the sound of distant tires rolling over cobbled roads. Alyssa arrived early, an hour before the usual unlock, and stood outside Whisked Corner as if seeing it with new eyes. She didn't rush to open the door. Instead, she studied the bakery's faded sign and cracked steps as if they belonged to a stranger's story, not her own. When she finally turned the key, the bell above the door sang a note she hadn't heard in a while, one that didn't echo loneliness. She moved through the space gently, like someone who had once broken a sacred thing and was learning to touch again. The countertop was wiped in long strokes, the displays cleaned with deliberate care, and even the floor, with its creaks and bruises, was mopped as if expecting guests. There was no real proof that yesterday had meant anything more than a child's curiosity. But still, something in Alyssa's chest pulsed like a whisper of spring beneath winter's last frost. It wasn't joy, not yet. But it was no longer despair. It was something in between, and that, she decided, was worth following. At 10 minutes past 10, the bell jingled again, once, twice, and then 4 more times in the next hour. Alyssa, who had prepared only a modest tray of pastries, found herself running back into the kitchen to bake more. There was a woman who asked about that tart the child had yesterday, and a gentleman who said his wife had insisted he try the place that smells like a page from her grandmother's diary. Then came an older couple, visitors from Marlow Hill, who said they'd been told to come specifically for the Raspberry Miracle. Alyssa's mind raced. She hadn't posted anything online. There were no flyers or promotions, but somehow word had begun to spread, not loud or flashy like Dean's Cafe, but steady and real, like warm soup passed hand to hand in a cold village. Even Naomi, skeptical but loyal, stopped by to raise an eyebrow at the bustle and say, "I don't know what you did, but don't stop doing it." Alyssa laughed, a sound that had stayed locked behind her ribs for too long, and replied, "I just showed up. Maybe that's the trick." But beneath her smile, questions flickered like fireflies. Who was that woman? Why had her visit felt like a pebble dropped into still water, rippling farther than reason allowed? That evening, just as Alyssa was stacking the final chairs and humming a tune she didn't realize she remembered, the bell chimed once more. In walked the elderly man with suspenders, the same one who had sat near the bookshelf during the morning rush, sipping tea like it was the most important ceremony of the day. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Hollis. "Do you have a moment?" he asked in a voice lined with gravel and gentleness. Alyssa nodded, unsure. He pulled out a white envelope from the inner pocket of his coat and placed it on the table. It was thick, folded precisely, and bore no name on the front. "From the woman yesterday," he explained. "She doesn't like grand entrances." Alyssa hesitated before opening it, her fingers unsure whether they should shake or stay steady. Inside was a gold-edged card, Layla Jameson Foundation, Private Family Trust, a name that rang like distant thunder. The Jamesons weren't just wealthy, they were woven into the very fabric of Glimmer Row, quiet powerhouses behind hospitals, libraries, and old, faceless charities. Evelyn Jameson was a name whispered at gala tables and stitched into the backs of donated pews. Alyssa looked up at Hollis, eyes wide with disbelief. "She owns the estate across the river," he added gently. "She never forgets kindness. She tasted your tart and said it reminded her of her mother. That's not something she says often." Alyssa's throat closed like a door caught in wind. Why me?" she whispered, afraid to exhale. Mr. Hollis leaned back in the chair, folding his hands atop his cane. "Some people scream for the world to see them. Others whisper, but the right souls still hear." He nodded toward the kitchen. "She heard you. Your silence, your sorrow, your sincerity. And she thinks it deserves to be seen." Alyssa sat still for what felt like hours, the weight of the moment pressing down like a blanket made of bricks and wonder. When she finally spoke, it was only to say thank you, though even that felt too small for what had just shifted inside her. After Hollis left, she locked up and stood in the middle of her bakery, alone, but somehow not lonely. The card lay on the counter like a seed, and Alyssa, now cautiously blooming again, realized something had changed. Not just in the business, not even in the town, but in her. And though she didn't know what the Jamesons truly wanted, she did know this: the wind had changed direction, and this time it was blowing in her favor. By the time another week slid past like butter on a hot pan, Whisk Corner had begun to hum again, not the loud, frantic buzz of trendy joints that confused noise with success, but a steady, heartbeat-like rhythm that told Alyssa something sacred had returned. Customers no longer came just for the tart. They came for what the place made them feel. The walls still wore their age unapologetically, and the tables hadn't grown newer legs overnight, but the space glowed with the kind of honesty money couldn't buy. There was laughter again, low and layered like a good stew. Names were exchanged between strangers, and on more than one occasion, someone left a thank-you note tucked beneath a sugar jar. Alyssa moved through the cafe like someone rediscovering her legs after a long crawl, still cautious, but no longer crippled by doubt. She no longer flinched at the sound of the bell. She welcomed it like a familiar knock from a long-lost friend. But amid all this quiet bloom, her mind kept circling the card now tucked into the drawer beside her mother's recipe book. The Jamesons hadn't reached out directly again, and she hadn't asked for more, but their ripple still shaped her tide. One particularly golden afternoon, Alyssa stepped out for a breath of fresh air and nearly ran into Dean, who had been loitering at the edge of the street like a bad memory that refused to fade. He wore his usual arrogance like cologne, strong enough to choke a room. His eyes darted past her to the tables inside, where 3 new families were laughing over warm pastries and tea. "Business suddenly booming?" he asked, feigning casual interest, but his voice cracked slightly at the edge. Alyssa looked him over, not with bitterness, but with the detached curiosity of someone inspecting a pair of shoes they once wore and outgrew. "People are just remembering what matters," she replied, brushing a crumb from her sleeve. Dean chuckled, but it lacked flavor. "Zara thinks you're lucky. Says you must have bribed someone or got a pity feature from that rich woman." Alyssa smiled softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Tell Zara she's welcome to try my raspberry tart and see if it tastes like pity." Before Dean could retort, the bell chimed behind her, and she turned, leaving him outside like a shadow with nowhere to fall. That night, when she told Naomi about the encounter, her friend roared with laughter and shouted, "Girl, you served him cold pie with no spoon." The next morning, Evelyn Jameson arrived unannounced. She didn't come in a limo or with a trail of assistants, just a gray coat, leather gloves, and an aura that demanded neither attention nor apology. Alyssa nearly dropped the tray she was holding when she saw her at the door, but Evelyn raised a hand gently, signaling calm. "May I sit?" she asked, her voice like the hush before rain. Alyssa nodded, gesturing to the booth by the window, the one her mother once favored. Evelyn examined the room with a kind of reverence, then looked Alyssa in the eye and said, "I grew up on bread like yours, before estates and trusts and titles. Your tart was more than food, it was memory." Alyssa tried to respond, but her words caught in her throat. Evelyn continued, I support women who remind the world how to listen. That's what you do here. You make people pause. Then she reached into her bag and brought out a brown envelope. This isn't charity. This is partnership. You decide how and when to grow, but when you're ready, there are doors I can help you open. Alyssa accepted the envelope with trembling fingers, her heart thudding like a choir drum. After Evelyn left, she remained seated for a long time, staring at the spot where the woman had sat, half convinced the moment had been a dream stitched together by hope. Later that week, as whispers spread of Alyssa's supposed mystery investor, the townsfolk grew curious in the way only small towns can, soft gossip wrapped in admiration and envy. Dean, now visibly unraveling, tried every trick in his limited book to win back attention. He lowered prices, hired a new pastry chef, and even posted a badly edited video claiming he was the original mind behind Whist Corner. But the crowd didn't return. You can't season soup with lies and expect it to taste like truth. Alyssa, on the other hand, kept her head down and her sleeves rolled up. She began updating the decor slowly, repainting corners, replacing cracked saucers, rehanging her mother's framed recipes with brass nails that gleamed in the sun. Customers noticed not because it was flashy, but because it felt like watching someone love something back to life. One woman leaned over the counter and said, "This place feels like a hug I didn't know I needed." Alyssa only smiled, her eyes dancing like a candle's flame. She didn't need to shout her victory. It was baked into the walls now, warm and rising, like bread that had finally remembered how to breathe. When a wind changes direction, it doesn't make an announcement. It simply shifts, and the leaves follow. That was how Whist Corner began to whisper its comeback, not with noise or trumpet blasts, but with steady footsteps and murmurs of mouths that tasted truth in every bite. Alyssa stopped trying to explain the growth. It wasn't sudden like a lightning strike, but more like the creeping light of dawn. The days now moved differently, still fast in some ways, but no longer heavy. There was a rhythm to it, flour in the air before sunrise, the sound of the oven ticking with anticipation, the bell over the door playing its quiet melody, and the gentle scuff of chairs pulled out by people who had started calling the place their little corner of comfort. Naomi began dropping in more often, not to check on her friend anymore, but to help. Sleeves rolled, apron on, gossip flowing. Even the old jukebox by the wall blinked back to life after a simple wire fix, and now played soft vinyl tracks that wrapped the shop in gentle nostalgia. Alyssa never expected this chapter, and some nights she still caught herself waiting for it all to dissolve. But then she'd run her fingers across the wooden counter and feel the scratches from years of use, like veins in an old hand, proof that survival didn't always roar. Sometimes it whispered, "I'm still here." It was on one of those golden-hued afternoons that the final curtain on Dean and Zara's charade began to fall. The couple who once danced in the limelight of Alyssa's downfall had now become background noise in a town that had turned its head. Zara, ever hungry for glitter, had grown increasingly discontent with their fading spotlight. She began skipping shifts, spending more time on her phone than behind the register, her voice louder than the espresso machine, her fake laughter curdling milk from a distance. Dean, too proud to admit their empire was crumbling, doubled down, revamping the menu with flavors stolen from Alyssa's old notebook, trying desperately to bottle lightning in a counterfeit jar. But the thing about borrowed recipes is that they come without the soul, and customers could taste the difference. Rumors swirled like smoke from a dying fire. One day, a familiar woman from the local newspaper came into Whist Corner, notepad in hand, eyes sharp as a tailor's needle. "They told me this place reminded them of something they lost," she said, sipping the raspberry tart tea. "Turns out it's not just a bakery. It's a story." Alyssa smiled, unsure how to respond. She didn't want fame. She wanted peace. But she also understood now that her quiet survival had become its own kind of anthem, one that didn't require a stage, just open hearts. And then came the day that made her stop mid-step, heart thudding like thunder in a teacup. It was early evening, the bakery warm and filled with soft chatter, when Layla returned, wearing her yellow boots again, this time with a drawing in hand. "It's you," she said, handing over a crayon sketch of Alyssa behind the counter, smiling with a crown made of whipped cream and strawberries. Behind her stood Evelyn, elegant as always, her eyes dancing like one who saw magic where others saw mere moments. "She insisted we come today," Evelyn said. "Told me you'd need a reminder." Alyssa blinked hard, taking the drawing with both hands as if it were made of glass. Evelyn stayed a moment longer and then, in a rare motion, reached into her bag again, not with a check, but a simple envelope. Inside was a flyer, Women of Wholeness, a national conference for female entrepreneurs. "There's a seat with your name on it," Evelyn said. "Only if you're ready." Alyssa stared at the invitation, her throat tightening with 100 unsaid things. Ready wasn't the word she would have used. But willing? Maybe. She nodded slowly, and Evelyn gave a soft smile, the kind that said, "We see you now." As they left, Alyssa placed Layla's drawing in a frame beside the register where it caught the morning sun like a blessing written in color. The silence after they left didn't feel empty. It felt full, like air after a summer rain. Alyssa stood in the doorway long after the last customer left, watching the sky bleed into dusk, colors curling over the rooftops like spilled paint. Across the street, Dean stood in the doorway of his fading cafe, shoulders slumped, alone. The tables were empty, his name fading on the glass, and the twinkle lights that once sparkled now flickered with the kind of desperation that couldn't be masked. He caught her eyes briefly, and for a moment, the man who had once mocked her looked more like someone lost at sea with no oar, just regret as his anchor. Alyssa didn't wave. She didn't gloat. She simply turned the sign on her door to closed, walked back inside, and wiped the counter clean with one hand while cradling the drawing in the other. That night, she wrote a single line in her journal before turning in. Not all victories are loud, but some are deep enough to echo forever. The lights dimmed, the ovens cooled, and the heartbeat of Whist Corner kept ticking, steady, unbothered, alive. The sun rose on Glimmer Row without fanfare, its soft gold sliding across rooftops like spilled honey, dripping into corners that had long forgotten warmth. Inside Whist Corner, the light touched everything gently, the shelves lined with jars of homemade marmalade, the worn floorboards smoothed by years of feet and fate, and the framed drawing of a woman in a whipped cream crown. Alyssa stood behind the counter, tying her apron in a single knot the way her mother used to, fingers now steady with a calm that didn't ask for permission. The bell jingled thrice in the first hour, then didn't stop for the next 5. A local choir group came in for breakfast, laughing in harmonies. A pair of retired teachers arrived and asked if the lemon scones still had the magic. And around midday, a delivery boy dropped off a bouquet of lavender and mint tied with raffia and no card. Alyssa didn't need to guess. She placed the flowers beside the framed tart recipe near the cash box. They gave the space a scent like Sunday morning joy. Everything now moved with a grace that couldn't be forced. Customers opened the door like they were stepping into memory, and left like they had borrowed hope and promised to return it. Alyssa no longer counted seats or weighed silence like failure. She listened only to the hum that filled the room when strangers felt safe enough to stay. Not long after the bakery's steady bloom became the town's quiet pride, word of Whist Corner stretched farther than Glimmer Row. One morning, a woman arrived with a camera bag and a notebook, introducing herself as Celine from the Regional Taste. She didn't make a fuss, didn't ask for staged shots. She just ordered a tart and sat in the corner for 3 hours, observing with the kind of stillness that made even the air hush. Before she left, she shook Alyssa's hand with both of hers and said, "You didn't just survive. You built a house with the broken pieces." The feature came out 2 weeks later under the headline, "The Woman Who Baked Through the Storm." It wasn't dramatic, but it told the story with respect, and customers from towns Alyssa had never even visited began showing up. One woman from Maple Ridge cried into her tea and said, "I came because I needed to believe people like you exist." Another brought her teenage daughter just to show her that resilience can taste like raspberry and cinnamon. Alyssa never allowed the praise to make her head heavy. She smiled, nodded, and kept working. Even when Evelyn returned to say she'd arranged for her to speak at a conference in Brighton, Alyssa hesitated. "Do I have anything worth saying?" she asked. Evelyn smiled like someone who already knew the answer and replied, "You said it already. Every day. With your hands." That night, Alyssa stood in the center of the bakery, lights low, and whispered, "Mama, can you see this?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of presence. One morning, months after the bakery's quiet rebirth had settled into something stable and true, Alyssa stepped out with Naomi to the town center where a small fair had been organized. Booths lined the park, children danced to drummers, and locals peddled soap, jams, and beadwork. But what caught her attention was the vacant stall across from the floral tent, Dean, sitting behind it like a man made of paper left in the rain. His table was bare save for two sad-looking muffins and a wilted placard that read, "Carter Cafe Bakes." His hair was longer now, unkempt, and his eyes had the dullness of someone chasing shadows. For a moment, their eyes met. No words passed. No one shouted or gloated. Alyssa simply gave him a slow nod, the kind you give a page you've finally finished reading. She walked on. Naomi said nothing at first, but later, as they sat under the jacaranda trees eating roasted corn, she muttered, "If tables could talk, his would cry." Alyssa didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned back and said, "Some stories are best told in silence." He wrote his ending the moment he mocked my beginning. Then she tossed the husk into the bin and wiped her hands slowly, like someone done with dust. She never spoke of Dean again, not out of bitterness, but because some chapters close themselves when you stop rereading the pain. The day of the Brighton conference arrived like a drumbeat in her chest, steadily, insistently, with a mix of nerves and quiet pride. Naomi traveled with her, refusing to let her go shine without someone to scream amen from the front row. The hall was filled with women in bright dresses and sharp shoes, the air buzzing with stories waiting to be told. When Alyssa stepped on stage, she didn't begin with numbers or business models. She started with a broken mug, with a raspberry tart, with laughter across the street and silence that bruised. And then she spoke of hope that didn't shout, of kindness wrapped in memory, and how sometimes the people who dismiss you are merely setting the stage for those who'll truly see you. The hall was so still you could hear hearts stretch open. When she finished, they rose, not with the roaring of applause, but with the kind of silence that clapped with soul. Afterward, as they walked back to their hotel, Naomi looped her arm through Alyssa's and whispered, "You didn't just bake through the storm. You turned thunder into sugar." Alyssa smiled and looked up at the stars. Maybe the storm was the recipe all along, and for the first time in years, she believed that even broken things could rise, flower, woman, and all. Don't let someone else's laughter become the punctuation mark to your story. Life may bruise you, business may crumble, and people may walk away just when you need them most, but remember, endings are not final when you still have breath. Hold on. Your quiet persistence, your honesty, your heart, they are seeds. And even if the world doesn't clap for you now, one day the right people will gather to hear your story, and they will taste the truth in your victory. Let your silence build strength, not shame. Sometimes, all it takes is one unexpected moment, one soul who sees you, to remind you that you're not finished, you're just warming up. Heavenly Father, thank you for being the God who sees, even in the shadows of our struggle, for every listener walking through rejection, for every heart that's been mocked or overlooked. Breathe courage again. Turn their pain into purpose, their waiting into wisdom, their setbacks into stepping stones. May doors open where doubt once stood. May their hands find strength, their stories find power, and their names find favor in places they never imagined. Restore what was lost, multiply what remains, and let their next chapter be louder than every mockery behind them. In Jesus' name, let their testimony rise like fresh bread, warm, fragrant, undeniable. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.